My name is Jennifer Gillick, and I am the Program Director at the Northwest Chapter of the American Parkinson Disease Association, which is a mouthful, so let's just call it APDA. Our Northwest Chapter, I'm located in Seattle, and we cover the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. And we provide support, education, and services that will help everyone impacted by Parkinson's live life to the fullest. Like I said earlier, one of the great things about this sort of Zoom presentation is that people can join us from all over. So thank you for joining us. We're really excited that you're going to be a part of this very special two-part program focused on your gut health. Today, the program is part of our monthly education series, which is called Take Control. And what that series is designed to do is to give people who are impacted by Parkinson's the opportunity to hear from and interact with experts in the field. Because we know that Parkinson's is so complex and it can affect everybody a little differently. So we truly believe that the more you know, the more empowered you can become in living your best life. So we like to bring people once a month to talk about different subjects. If you ever have a suggestion about what you'd like to hear about, we're happy to hear it, and we'll seek out an expert who can talk about it. So the American Parkinson Disease Association, for those of you who don't know, we are the largest grassroots network dedicated to fighting Parkinson's disease, and we work to assist the nearly 1 million Americans who are living with Parkinson's disease. Our website at apdaparkinson.org. You can visit that and learn about an array of programs and services offered by our organization. So move on to the next slide, Kelly. The work of APDA is made possible through the support of donors and sponsors. So I'd like to take a second to recognize the sponsors of this program. Our gold sponsor is Boston Scientific, and our bronze sponsor is Kiowa Kirin. So I want to thank you, both of these organizations, for valuing these educational programs and for their financial support of APDA, because that really allows us to continue doing these programs and the work that we do. And to those of you who donated to our organization when you registered, thank you for your support. We truly appreciate it. And if you missed out on an opportunity, of course, there is always an opportunity to donate to APDA. So if you're in a financial position to do so, please consider making a donation. It funds all the programs and services. And you can do so at apdaparkinson.org/Northwest. All right, let's go to the main event. In the last decade, there has been an explosion of research into the human microbiome, and most of that microbiome is located right in your gut. Researchers are actively exploring the relationship between the gut and Parkinson's disease, and there is strong evidence to support that Parkinson's actually starts in your gut. Our speaker, Dr. Kelly Condefer, who is a movement disorders specialist located in Wenatchee, Washington, has taken a special interest in this field, and she's going to share with you today some of this exciting research. When Kelly is done with her program, we will open up the program to questions. So there is a Q&A feature within Zoom, so you can type your question at any time in that box, and we will try to answer your question. The presentation is also being recorded and will be available on the APDA Northwest YouTube channel early next week, as well as Dr. Condefer's slides. So welcome, Dr. Kelly Condefer. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm so excited to give this lecture. As you said, I have a special interest in this topic. And in my opinion, I think some of the most exciting breakthroughs that we're going to see in Parkinson's is going to come out of some of this research. So I'm so happy to be here today. And I hope that you'll come away from the talk with a good understanding of how our digestive health actually impacts our neurological health. And I'm going to try to give you some tips for maximizing that as we talk through this topic. So I got interested in the role that bacteria play in our health probably about 10 years ago when I read an interesting journal article about how certain bacteria that were linked with gum disease and bad dentition were strongly linked with cardiovascular disease and heart disease. And I just thought this was an amazing thing. It was completely different from the way that I was taught about heart disease in medical school. And it really blew my mind that something as unrelated as bacteria in your mouths could potentially impact such a big aspect of health as heart disease. So since then, I've kind of been actively following research in this field. There's a huge research effort called the Human Microbiome Project that's been going on since around 2007, where they've been cataloging all of the bacteria that live within our systems. And we term that the microbiome. And it's really revolutionized and changed how we view almost every medical condition that we treat, including Parkinson's disease. So there's some very interesting things coming out of this. For instance, what if I told you that in the near future, we might be treating Parkinson's disease with fecal transplants? Or what if I told you that the mix of bacteria that we have in our guts could potentially determine whether or not a person developed Parkinson's disease or not in their life? We don't have answers to all these questions just yet, but this is a field that's growing exponentially. And I'm going to try to talk to you about just some of the most exciting things coming out of this research today. One thing that we already know from this line of research is that the bacteria in our guts have a profound influence on the function and the health of our nervous systems, even though no bacteria actually exist in our brains. And so I'm going to be talking to you today about how this communication system works between your gut and your brain, and how the microbiome serves as a coordinator of this amazing complex interaction between our brains and our guts. And it also is a good example of how the food we eat can actually influence our neurological health. And one association that's come out of research in this area, just to give you an example, is the fact that just taking one course of antibiotics, like for a 1 week long course of antibiotics, for instance, has been shown to raise a person's risk of then developing major depression or anxiety disorder by about 25 to 30%. And so it's very clear that altering the bacteria that reside within us can have profound effects on our mood, behavior, and neurological health. And this is truly new information that people like me who were in medical school 20 years ago did not learn. This is just very exciting and coming out now. So, but before we get into a discussion about the gut-brain microbiome axis, as a medical doctor, I would really like to take a moment to honor some ancient medical systems which for thousands of years have already understood a lot of the concepts that I'm going to talk to you about today. These ancient medical systems, like traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine from ancient India, understood that we humans are not just separate compartmentalized bunches of organ systems, but rather we are completely integrated with nature and the environment and the universe around us. And these two diagrams here just represent Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine. And you can see that they are both based on this concept of the 5 elements of which all matter in the universe, including us, is made. And so I'm not going to be talking in depth about these concepts here, but I wanted to mention these medical systems because both systems firmly recognized for thousands of years that all disease actually starts in the gut. And we are now seeing science bear that out. And the research in the gut-brain microbiome axis is just starting to prove a lot of the concepts that TCM and Ayurvedic medicine already taught us. So I think it's just very important that we modern medical practitioners pay homage to these systems and understand that in the future, I think the biggest medical advances are going to come from cooperative learning, utilizing ancient knowledge like this and our modern medical research. Now, in order to understand the gut-brain axis, we first need to understand what the autonomic nervous system is. And you've probably heard of the autonomic nervous system because it's highly involved in Parkinson's disease. And what the autonomic nervous system is basically the part of our nervous system which runs all of the automatic processes in our bodies, okay? And like all other processes in the universe, the autonomic nervous system is operating in a balance between two opposing sorts of forces. And I like to use just the analogy of the yin and yang that we get from Chinese medicine. So the yin force you can think of as the parasympathetic part of your autonomic nervous system. It's more restorative and calming effects. And then the yang is more your sympathetic, your fight or flight activating force within your nervous system. And again, there's a constant balance between these two systems of the autonomic nervous system. And every single organ in our bodies has inputs from both systems. So you can see everything from your eyes to your heart to your lungs and down into your digestive tract has inputs that come from our central nervous system, which carry the information of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic autonomic nervous systems. So remember that our nervous systems evolved to keep us alive out there in the wild when many, many years ago, humans used to get chased by things like saber-toothed tigers. And so we evolved this sympathetic nervous system, this fight or flight automatic response as a survival mechanism. And the trouble is, though, that, you know, this system wasn't meant to be active all the time. But in the world that we live in now, where we have different types of stressors and different types of constant stimulation, many people are living in a state where their nervous system is always in this fight, flight, or freeze type of state. And their parasympathetic nervous system, which is mediated mostly by your vagus nerves, is not active enough. And there's a lot of evidence actually in Parkinson's disease for this. Parkinson's seems to be somewhat of a state of overactivity of the sympathetic nervous system and not enough vagus nerve or input. And one example of that you might think of as freezing. Anyone who's experienced freezing of gait can tell you that if they're frozen and they feel nervous, or if someone's trying to rush them along, the freezing only gets worse. And there are a lot of some scientists actually looking at ways of stimulating the vagus nerve, that restorative calming aspect of your nervous system, to treat things like freezing. So basically, this parasympathetic part of your nervous system exerts its power on the vagus, on the body via the vagus nerve. And this is a very important component of the gut-brain axis, as you'll see in a moment. And we really need to keep these systems in balance in order to achieve the best neurological health. So how do we best keep this proper balance? We're going to talk about that a bit more. So the way that the autonomic nervous system is connected to the gut-brain axis is basically that the autonomic nervous system is essentially the main highway of communication between your brain, your large brain in your head, with your second brain in your gut. Okay? The gut-brain axis is basically a bidirectional communication system linking these two brains. And by bidirectional, we mean that the activity that's going on in your gut is actually influencing your brain, and vice versa. What's going on in the brain can actually influence the gut. And this communication is influenced by the bacteria that are in the gut. So on a basic level, you can think of these bacteria as helping to translate some of the information that's going from the gut to the brain and vice versa. Now, the other thing to know is that both your brain in your head and your brain in your gut, which is called your enteric nervous system, are developmentally related. When we were developing as an embryo, both of those structures were developed out of the same tissue. And this will become important as we talk. We'll see the importance of this later on, how that relates to Parkinson's disease. And this little brain that's in your gut actually is like a second brain. It has the same number of neurons as the brain of a cat or a dog. So there's a lot of activity going on in there and a lot of communication. And remember that this communication goes both ways. So it means that the brain influences the gut and digestion. And so that means that your thoughts and your mood actually can influence the bacteria and the digestion going on in the gut, which is one reason why they always say don't eat when you're angry, because this actually can disrupt the digestive process. And the same goes for vice versa. The gut can actually influence a lot of our thoughts, behaviors, and moods. And we'll be coming back to that concept throughout this talk. So it's important to understand. So although this is a new area of science, it's really not a new area of human experience. I think we have always understood that there was some connection between how our bellies felt and how we were feeling in our heads. You know, things like the gut feeling or the expression of having butterflies in your stomach. This is the system we're talking about here. It's just that we now have a lot more science behind it to explain some of the mechanisms. And now there's several ways actually that your gut communicates with the brain. One of the main ones is through the vagus nerve, through your autonomic nervous system. But some of the other ways include hormone signaling between both of your brains. And others ways that the brain and gut communicate is through your immune system. And we're going to be talking about that a little further as we go on. Okay, so how important is this microbiome? How important are these bacteria that are living in our gut that are helping translate this information between the gut and the brain? Well, in short, they are very important. If you look at this picture, this gives you an idea. It shows you that we actually, every human body is actually made up of more bacteria DNA than human DNA. So it's kind of like our human DNA, you know, whereas when you think of DNA, so you remember that every single cell in our bodies contains all of our DNA, which is basically our blueprint for life. And each of our cells has our own DNA. It's made up of about 20,000 genes in the human genome. Now, your gut actually contains about 22 to 20 million bacterial genes. So there's much more bacterial genetic information in our bodies than human. which is just a very fascinating thought to me. The bacteria primarily reside in our colon, and that's what I'll just be referring to throughout this talk as your microbiome. But we also have microbiomes in our lungs, on our skin, and these microbiomes also have implications for human health, but we're going to be focused on the gut microbiome today. Now, to give you another visual of how much bacteria we have in us, if you isolated all the bacteria from our guts, it would weigh about 5 pounds on average. So that's quite a bit of physical matter too, as well as the DNA. And we know how important these bacteria are from studies looking at what would happen, for instance, if you had an animal who was born without any bacteria. And there have actually been studies looking at this. They have bred mice who are called sterile mice. They are born without any bacteria in them. And these mice show abnormalities of their development. They do not develop normal neurological systems. They show autistic type behaviors. And so this has shown us just how critical that these bacteria are for our development and our ongoing health throughout our lives. And study after study also shows that the more diverse, meaning the more different types of bacteria that you have in your microbiome, generally the better your health is. And studies have linked longevity and good health with people who have more diverse microbiomes. And less diverse microbiomes have been linked with such diverse things as autism and lots of other conditions. So it seems that our microbiomes need to be robust, they need to be diverse. And this just shows us another way of how we are just so linked with our environment. We have pieces of our environment in us in the form of these bacteria, which have profound impact on our health. Now, how can we characterize this vast mix of bacteria that live within us? Does everyone just have a completely different mix of bacteria, or is there a theme to it? Are there different ways that people can be grouped? And actually, the research in this area has shown that each of us every single person can be characterized into one of 3 different enterotypes, they're called. So sometimes it's 2 because 2 of them kind of merge together. And you can see that these enterotypes are basically we can be characterized into an enterotype based on the particular mix of bacteria, that we have in our guts, and which bacteria are prominent or predominant. So for instance, one enterotype is mostly dominated by the bacteria Bacteroides. And then the other type are your Prevotella ruminococcus enterotypes. That means that that's kind of the dominant bacteria in those people. And it's quite fascinating because you can fit any human into one of these types, and it doesn't matter where you live, it doesn't matter what race you are, what sex you are, we all fit one of these types. And the thing that seems to determine our type is our diet, okay? So the people who are Bacteroides predominant tend to be the people whose diet is mostly made up of animal products, okay? And then the other 2 types are people who make up most of their diet is made up of vegetables and plant fibers and things like that. So you can probably get an idea of where you might fit without even having your own microbiome tested. Now, the question is, though, what enterotype is best for Parkinson's? That's the first question that came to my mind. Is there a theme? And the answer is just not quite that simple. We don't have this completely worked out yet. Many laboratories all over the world are really working on this question, and there are certain themes just emerging regarding the microbiome and Parkinson's. But I'll get into that in a minute.
Kelly.
Yes.
Hey, it's Jen. We seem to be having some slides that are not progressing. So will you stop sharing your screen for a moment and reshare it? Because I don't know how to fix it. It's working on my end, but not working on other people's ends.
Okay, so wait, so I should go, okay, so stop
sharing your screen.
Okay.
And share it again.
Share again. Let me see.
I know, technical difficulties.
I'm not very good at this.
I know, it's okay. So those of you who are on the line, will you type in if you're seeing a different screen now? And then Kelly, will you move it back and move it forward to make sure they're changing?
Can you see that? Did you see it?
Well, I can. Okay, it's looking like it's working.
Okay, great.
Whew, phew. Okay, that was the way to change it. So, sorry to interrupt, and sorry for the technology difficulties, but everyone is seeing it now. I'm getting lots of great comments.
Okay, good. Everyone sees it. Okay, just let me know. We can always load and try.
All right, so I'm exiting. Continue, please.
All right, good. Okay, where was I? So we were talking about these enterotypes and how your diet kind of determines which one, where you fall, which enterotype you have. And the fact that we don't know necessarily that one of them is best for Parkinson's versus the other, but we do know that the people who fit into this more vegetable-based enterotype, the Prevotella ruminococcus type, seem to have higher levels of something called short chain fatty acids, which I'm going to describe a little more in the next slide. But these are basically beneficial, usually beneficial substances that are produced by bacteria that seem to have anti-inflammatory properties on our body. And the people who are the animal-based product, Bacteroides predominant, don't produce as much as those of those short chain fatty acids, whereas the vegetable-based do. So there may be some benefits to that. And there's also a lot of studies in many other fields just showing over and over and over again the benefits of eating mostly a plant-based diet on cardiovascular disease, cancer risk. So it just kind of, you could kind of take all this together. And if you look at all of that information, I think it's safe to conclude that it's probably better to have more of a plant-based diet. But as far as where this fits, as far as Parkinson's yet, we don't exactly know. But I'm going to get into that a little more here in a minute. Let's just take a minute to define some terms here that I'm going to be using throughout the talk that you've probably come across and that you will come across when you read more about the microbiome. First of all, the term probiotic. Okay, probiotic just refers to bacteria that actually promote and support the growth of other beneficial bacteria in the gut. We're going to talk later about probiotics, the commercial kind, that you can buy, and whether they're worth taking and what you need to know about them. Now, the term prebiotic refers not to a bacteria, but the prebiotic foods are actually foods that nourish the beneficial bacteria in our gut. And these are generally foods made of plants, essentially. There aren't too many meats or dairy products that are prebiotic. So generally these are plant foods. Now the term commensal refers to bacteria that do us no harm generally when they are in balance. And so these are bacteria that live within us. And when they're in the proper balance, our bodies work well. But if they get out of balance, they can become a problem. And they can turn into pathogenic bacteria. So pathogenic refers to bacteria and other organisms that can actually cause infections. So these are things like C. difficile colitis, bacteria that cause pneumonia, bacteria that cause food poisoning. So it's basically our probiotic and our commensal bacteria that have to be healthy in our system in order to fend off the pathogenic bacteria. Now, another term to know about, we just mentioned, it's called short chain fatty acids, or SCFA. And an example of a substance of short chain fatty acids is butyrate. Now, most of the time, so these are produced by some of the beneficial bacteria in our guts, and these generally seem to have anti-inflammatory properties. And in fact, in conditions such as multiple sclerosis, for instance, there's been very strong links shown that people with MS can lack bacteria that produce short chain fatty acids like butyrate. And remember, these bacteria that produce these beneficial fatty acids generally come from a plant-based diet. Now, a little term to know about that's something that's kind of not beneficial is called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. And I'm going to be mentioning this in the next couple slides, because LPS is actually a part of the cell wall of some bacteria that live within us normally. And the LPS is normally managed by our systems. We excrete it out with bowel movements. But if it builds up, it can be toxic to our systems if it gets into our bloodstream. And it can actually trigger a process called inflammation and neuroinflammation. So we're going to be talking a bit more about that in a minute. Dysbiosis is another term you might come across. Dysbiosis means that there's a state of imbalance in the microbiome, and where there's not the proper balance of good bacteria and some of these commensal bacteria that maybe are normally good, if they're unopposed or there's not enough diversity in the microbiome, they can become a problem. And there's some evidence that dysbiosis is playing a role in Parkinson's, among many, many other conditions. There's almost no medical condition out there where there hasn't been some connection to states of dysbiosis. So that's something we generally want to avoid. And then again, microbiome diversity is what we want to work towards. The microbiome being diverse is basically a healthy state of lots of different types of beneficial bacteria in our systems in a good state of balance. Now, I like to think of our microbiome as part of our inner pharmacy. And the inner pharmacy is a term that I actually learned from my own study of Ayurvedic medicine, because they very much understand this concept. And it's very interesting to see modern science bearing out these ancient ideas. But essentially, our bodies have this innate intelligence in them and how to heal and rebuild ourselves. And it turns out that a lot of that intelligence might actually be mediated by our microbiome. We have kind of forgotten this in modern medicine, and sometimes we tend to focus on treating diseases with chemical warfare and pharmaceuticals, which sometimes is necessary and beneficial. But for many chronic diseases, such as Parkinson's, we want to do everything we can to activate and protect our inner pharmacy. And this is basically coming from our bacteria. So our bacteria not only help translate messages between the brain and the gut, but the bacteria also act like little factories. They produce vitamins, they produce nutrients our bodies use. Some bacteria even produce neurotransmitters, such as dopamine, which is critical in Parkinson's disease. And our bacteria also ensure that when we digest food and there are waste products around, good bacteria make sure that those waste products get fermented rather than rot. You can kind of think of the difference between a, beautifully fermented, say, fresh sauerkraut versus some food that's been left out that basically is rotting and has mold on it. So you could consider that like the food that we digest, the waste products of it can either go the wonderful fermented way, or they can go the rotting way. And the bacteria in us really can help determine which way they go. And our good bacteria help ensure that those healthy fermentation goes on, rather than the damaging, toxic, rotting food. And then the bacteria also train and condition our immune system. So that there's a lot of research showing that the bacteria actually teach our immune system how to act. And this is quite fascinating. The bacteria also produce beneficial vitamins for us, such as vitamin K and biotin. So a lot of times, if you think about, you can have a healthy microbiome, and that might make it unnecessary to actually take vitamins and supplements. Now, of particular interest in Parkinson's is the microbiome's ability to produce neurotransmitters and the building blocks of neurotransmitters. And we all know that in Parkinson's, the most important transmitter is dopamine. And we used to focus on Parkinson's as the loss of brain cells in an area called the substantia nigra of the brain, which do produce dopamine. But now we know that dopamine is actually also produced in our guts. And it's produced by particular subspecies of bacteria called Bacillus subtilis is one example of bacteria which produce the precursors of dopamine. We don't yet know how to harness that in Parkinson's yet, but it's a very attractive idea that we might be able to treat Parkinson's by harnessing the gut bacteria's ability to produce dopamine. So it's very clear that our microbiome is critically important to our health in many ways. And it's also clear from the research that we need to have a healthy and diverse microbiome in order to enjoy good health. So how much control do we actually have over our microbiome? Well, it turns out that there are some factors that we can control that will affect the bacteria that live within us, and some that we can't. So some examples of some modifiable factors that can affect which bacteria live within us are our diets, as we talked about, whether you're eating a primarily animal product-based diet versus plants shifts your microbiome. Pharmaceutical drugs, how we respond to stress. Remember, the brain-gut pathway goes both ways. So if we are really affected by stress, that actually influences the actual bacteria in our microbiome. Things like pollution, pesticides in foods, antibiotic exposures, even our psychological state. These things can all affect which bacteria are thriving in us and which aren't. Now, some of the set factors include pre and perinatal factors. So it seems that our microbiome starts to form before birth, when the bacteria resident in our mother's bodies start to communicate and guide the connections being made and the growth happening and the synapses being made as our nervous systems develop. Remember, I told you about the sterile mice that don't develop normally. We need these bacteria around in order for our nervous systems to actually develop normally, when even before we're born. And there's evidence that during gestation, the commensal bacteria start to communicate with the brain and influence how we develop. So we don't really have control over those factors. That depends on our mother's state of health and situation and diet. And then when we are born and we go through the birth canal, we are further populated with the healthy organisms in our mother's birth canal. And then also when infants breastfeed, that also affects their microbiome and starts feeding their microbiome. And it seems that by age of about 3, we have about like an adult type of microbiome. And for a large part of it doesn't change so much as we go through life. But our particular collection of bacteria in our guts, remember there's 5 pounds of it, it's actually turning over about every 3 days. And for that reason, any lifestyle and diet changes we can make can actually have a profound effect on our microbiome, but we have to sustain them. We can't just make one intervention, like take a probiotic for a week and then think everything's going to be better, because the microbiome is just going to keep turning over and altering itself. So here's some things that we can do just to try to ensure that we have the most diverse bacteria in our gut that's going to help with our overall gut health and neurologic health. And so probably the most important thing to do is to eat a large variety of vegetables and fiber. These are the prebiotic substances that feed our good bacteria. And you want to try to get organic where possible, or grow your own vegetables, even better, because you'll see in a few slides how some of the substances that are sprayed on our food, in our food supply now, can affect our microbiome. Another thing you could do is just go outside in the woods, okay, and you breathe deeply. And what you're breathing in are bacteria and spores and things from the plants, especially if you happen to live in an area where there are ferns. These, just the environment that these plants live and thrive in, there's beneficial bacteria everywhere. So take a deep breath out in the woods. Try also to limit antibiotics. Now, it's not always possible to avoid antibiotics. Sometimes, especially if you have Parkinson's, you can be susceptible to things like urinary tract infections, pneumonia, and sometimes antibiotics are necessary. So I'm not telling you to go against your doctor's advice and don't take antibiotics, but I would say don't take antibiotics just for a sore throat or a cough. Try to avoid them if possible, because the antibiotics do interfere with the normal balance of bacteria. Interact with animals. Okay, animals carry lots of beneficial bacteria. So having pets, time and time again, there are studies showing health benefits of having pets. And this is, I think, one mechanism that occurs. Eat or drink fermented foods. You can even make fermented foods yourself. Kombucha is really popular now. That's got some beneficial bacteria. Sauerkrauts, kimchi. These are all foods that help nourish your microbiome. Try to limit your exposure to chemicals, including things you put on your body, such as deodorants, lotions. It's best to just stick with natural soaps, bar soaps, and try to avoid using too many things out of plastic bottles. Try to avoid, aluminum containing deodorants. These are all things that do affect our internal health. Now, probiotics are another option. We're going to talk about those more in a minute in more detail. And finally, you have to understand the idea that in order to have a healthy microbiome and a healthy digestive tract, it's important to have some sort of a mind-body practice that you practice. Whatever appeals to you. It can be anything from mindfulness practice to contemplative prayer type practices to yoga to Tai Chi. These are, remember this, bi-directional. The gut influences the brain and the brain influences the gut. So anything that we do that helps our mental health also helps our microbiome. Okay, let's take just a minute to look at the environment in which these wonderful gut bacteria live. They live in our intestinal mucosa. And the functions of the intestinal mucosa are two main functions. Okay, this is a picture of the lining of our gut. Okay, you see these little villi. These are outpouchings lined with mucosa. And imagine the surface area of this if it were stretched flat. The surface area within our guts actually would cover more than a tennis court if we took it out and we stretched it flat. That's how much of our body essentially is exposed to the outside world. Because think about it, when we take something in through our mouth and we eat it, then all of this tissue, this is our defense system, which allows us to choose what are the beneficial things from the food we're eating versus what are the toxic things and how do we keep them out. So the function of the intestinal mucosa is to both to keep toxic and disease-causing substances from entering our systems. So it's like a protective barrier, but it also orchestrates the absorption of nutrients out of our diet. And it allows us to translate those nutrients into the building blocks of life. And so it's a very, very complex environment. And this is where our bacteria live. Now, so you can see these little guys if you magnified this. Now, if you looked even closer at this mucosa through an electron microscope, for instance, or this is actually, I think this is this is an electron microscope picture of the lining of the gut, and it shows these proteins struck this beautiful protein lattice structure here. These are called tight junctions. Now, these tight junctions are critical because this is the smart system that allows the good stuff in and it keeps the bad stuff out. The immune system is our body's main protection and defense system. And 80% of our immune system is localized in the gut. So it's critical that this system function properly, because when the immune system recognizes what we're taking in and these tight junctions are working properly, then it allows us to assimilate all the wonderful things from our food, but it helps us also to keep out the bad things that are toxins. But so it's the job of the intestinal mucosa to do this barrier function. Now, if this mechanism fails, if these tight junctions fail, and the bad stuff gets into our bloodstream, then that sets our immune system on alert. It sends in the troops, and that's basically what inflammation is. It's when our immune system is alerted that something bad has gotten in, and they need to come in and take care of it. And that immune reaction or inflammation sometimes does damage to our bodies and our brains. So it's good for that system to be active sometimes to fight off infections and to get rid of toxins. But the trouble is that sometimes the barrier function of the intestines fails, and that inflammation is going on all the time. And that's very bad for us. And we're going to see in a second how that can be linked to Parkinson's. But the thing to know is that we have to protect our barrier function of our intestines in order for our immune systems to operate properly and our nervous systems to operate properly. Because remember that we said that the brain and the gut are formed from the same tissue embryologically. So when we are embryos, the brain and the gut are forming from the same tissue. And the same tight junctions here that you see in the gut are also localized in the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is our brain's barrier and protection against the outside world. And so when some of the things in our environment that damage our intestinal lining are also causing damage to those tight junctions in our blood-brain barrier. And that leads to a process called neuroinflammation. And neuroinflammation is turning out to be a huge driver and maybe even the reason that some people develop Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of research in this area now. And that's why it's so critical that we protect our microbiome, which helps maintain the integrity of the gut barrier. And in turn, it also helps the the brain, blood-brain barrier to stay intact. Now, one mechanism by which this neuroinflammation occurs has to do with the substance called lipopolysaccharide. Remember, I mentioned earlier LPS. LPS is basically a component of gram-negative bacteria, the wall of the bacteria. So it's normally present in us. We all have it. LPS seems to be a key player in the story of how a breakdown of the protective barrier in the gut can lead to neuroinflammation and disease in the brain, like Parkinson's. So remember that without healthy bacteria, our immune systems in the guts can't work well, and they can't tell our intestines what to keep out and what to let in. And what happens is we can have a rise in LPS levels in our guts, especially after we eat. And this is a normal occurrence, okay? And this is where food comes in, because your LPS levels rise a whole lot more when you eat a fatty fried meal, say cheeseburger and French fries. Your LPS levels are gonna skyrocket. Whereas if you ate a plate of vegetables, your LPS levels only rise a little bit when you eat. Now, normally, LPS will get removed from our gut by bowel movements, okay? But if the LPS hangs around and it's allowed to cross the intestinal lining, it can trigger inflammation and disrupts gut-brain communication. Okay, there's evidence that LPS, in this situation where LPS is not being removed from our systems, that it actually enters the enteric nervous system. So it enters the nerves in the gut. Now these are directly connected through your vagus nerve again to your brain. And there's been evidence too linking LPS to disruption of dopamine receptors in the brain. LPS has also been found to disrupt function in cells called your dorsal root ganglia. These are the nerve cells that mediate pain in the body. And it probably has implications in fibromyalgia and other nerve pain conditions that many people suffer from. So, and there's also evidence, I'm not going to go into the scientific evidence in detail, but there are some very eloquent studies showing how LPS-mediated neuroinflammation drives Lewy body formation, which remember, that's the marker of Parkinson's in our cells, caused by accumulation of a protein called alpha-synuclein. And the same thing seems to be happening in Alzheimer's disease. So it's really critical. Now, the other thing that's interesting about LPS is that when LPS enters the neurons of your enteric nervous system, it shuts down the normal function of those neurons. So it perpetuates constipation. And anyone who has Parkinson's, a large proportion of you suffer from constipation. Constipation is a big part of Parkinson's. And what we get into when we start to really understand what the role LPS plays, is a little bit of a catch-22 situation, because we need to be having bowel movements in order to remove the LPS from our system. But with Parkinson's, often with constipation, you're not having regular bowel movements. So the LPS is just building up more and more. And then that's in turn affecting the enteric nervous system, making the constipation even worse. And so it's really critical that we address constipation in Parkinson's. And it's something that I think is really key to treating the condition, not just because it's uncomfortable to be constipated, but because the constipation might actually be driving some of this neuroinflammation issue. And that's why I want to take a second just to give you some tips on managing constipation. There's no magic bullet, but there are many things you can do to mitigate the constipation problem in Parkinson's. Now, one thing, these are just some things that I've come across, and also some things that have been studied. Warm prune juice and butter every morning, drink that down. When I was a fellow, we used to prescribe everyone something we called dynamite prunes. These were prunes soaked in senna tea, and that can be helpful to have one of those every day. A good quality probiotic, which we're going to talk about in a moment too. Many probiotics do help constipation. Another thing that might sound a little disgusting if you're not used to it is drinking warm water. And for some people, this is like a natural thing, and for other people, they find it really gross. But warm water, sometimes when we just drink ice water all the time, it actually stuns our digestive tract. Warm water facilitates digestion. So if you can give it a try, warm water mixed with lemon juice or warm water mixed with some raw honey is a great thing to drink every morning. Aloe vera juice. And then movement and exercise, and even acupuncture and acupressure. I don't have time to go into this. I think this would make an interesting entire talk, would be if we had an expert to be able to talk about how acupuncture and acupressure and massage can actually help to treat constipation, because it really does help. Okay. So you can see how important proper function of our gut lining is in regards to Parkinson's. And so it's very important that we understand some of the environmental factors which we are exposed to on a daily basis, how they can cause a breakdown in our gut lining. And the substance that I'm going to focus on is called glyphosate, okay, or it's also called Roundup. It's the chemical that's found in Roundup, which is very heavily marketed. It's very heavily used. It's sprayed on all of our food. And it's very important to understand glyphosate's effects, because it's probably playing a role in a lot of different disease processes, chronic diseases today. Now, by no means am I saying that glyphosate is the cause of Parkinson's disease, because there are many things to understand. Parkinson's is not caused by a single thing. Parkinson's is caused by having a genetic susceptibility to developing Parkinson's and then being exposed to some sorts of things in the environment that might trigger that susceptibility. Glyphosate is just one of those potential triggers. There are many others. You've all heard about pesticides being linked to Parkinson's, and even chemicals like dry cleaning chemicals have been linked to Parkinson's. But glyphosate's particularly important when we talk about the gut lining. Now, this might get a little bit technical, but hopefully not. Now, glyphosate was developed by the company Monsanto, and Monsanto is now owned by Bayer, which makes aspirin. And it's always interesting to me how chemical companies and drug companies end up teaming up like this. But this was the same company who developed the chemical Agent Orange, which was utilized in the Vietnam War as a defoliant. It would kill all the trees so that the soldiers could see the enemy soldiers below. And just understand that Agent Orange has been strongly linked to Parkinson's disease. Okay, it's been linked with many other diseases, diabetes, cancers, but glyphosate essentially is Monsanto's next generation defoliant that they developed. And the way that glyphosate works on plants is by inhibiting this pathway called the shikimate pathway. And the reason that the company says glyphosate is safe for humans is because we don't use the shikimate pathway. And it's true, humans do not use the shikimate pathway, but plants and bacteria do. And this is a metabolic pathway in plants and bacteria, which allows plants to produce things like, remember the inner pharmacy we talked about, amino acids and dopamine, neurotransmitters, chemicals called alkaloids, which are basically medicinal compounds that are found in plants. Vincristine is a chemotherapy agent, which is actually isolated from plants. So plants who are operating normally and whose shikimate pathway are operating normally produce natural chemotherapy agents that we can ingest and use. It also allows the plants to produce certain vitamins. Now, glyphosate blocks the production of these things in plants. And so in so doing, it actually, it essentially keeps the plants from being able to produce the beneficial things that we need to be healthy. And additionally, when we ingest glyphosate, it affects our bacteria. So it actually kills some of our digestive bacteria. And so it's taking away that aspect of our inner pharmacy. And what's a little alarming is that in 1996, GMO crops were developed that allowed farmers, commercial farmers, to spray glyphosate directly on the crops. So it wouldn't kill the crop, but it was killing all the weeds. And so this has actually led to our food becoming less nutritious. And a lot of foods contain high amounts of this glyphosate now. Now, another way that glyphosate affects us, not just by affecting the healthy bacteria and making the food that we eat less nutritious, it also affects those tight junctions that I mentioned earlier. Remember, the tight junctions it's the intelligent system in our lining of our guts that keeps the bad stuff out and allows the good stuff in. The tight junctions also exist in our blood-brain barrier. And glyphosate directly damages those tight junction proteins, leading to a condition that's called leaky gut. And some people even recognize the condition leaky brain that leads to that neuroinflammation. So unfortunately, glyphosate is still legal in this country, but at the end, I'll show you a website you can go to where you can look up the different levels of glyphosate in different foods. There's a project called the detoxproject.org, and alarmingly, the food that has the highest level of glyphosate is Cheerios, which many people eat thinking it's healthy because it's heart healthy. And so it's just something to be aware of, that this is another way to keep your microbiome as healthy as possible by avoiding as much as you can eating glyphosate. And by all means, just don't spray it in your yard. It's better to have a few dandelions around than to have this stuff anywhere near you. So that's just one takeaway from this. Okay, now we're going to turn specifically now to the question of what do we know about the microbiome in Parkinson's? Are there characteristics of it? Are there things wrong with the microbiome in Parkinson's? And this information is from a study that literally just came out a few weeks ago. It was a very large study. It verified some findings from some previous studies. And I'm going to just give you some takeaways from it. I'm not going to go into huge detail with this. But the bottom line is, we don't yet know how to manipulate the microbiome in Parkinson's. We can't tell you yet, here, take this particular probiotic and it's going to fix Parkinson's. It's simply not that simple. But there are some major themes coming out. Now, this study in particular, the number one finding was they found that in people who have Parkinson's, they had a decreased abundance of bacteria that produce short-chain fatty acids. So remember short-chain fatty acids from earlier. These are substances produced by bacteria that generally are from bacteria that come from eating plants. And these short-chain fatty acids have anti-inflammatory properties. So they found a decrease in these beneficial bacteria in people with Parkinson's. They also found an overabundance of certain opportunistic type pathogenic bacteria. It's not really important to know exactly the names, but I will point out that Prevotella is not always bad. Prevotella has been shown in other studies to be beneficial for health in a lot of ways. So this is where the waters get a little muddy when we're looking at the microbiome in Parkinson's, because you can't just say that one bacteria is bad, avoid it. It's very complex. Now, the other finding was that people with Parkinson's tended to have elevated levels of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. Now, why is this important? Well, lactobacillus happens to be one of the most common probiotics out there on the market. But it seems that in Parkinson's disease, it might not be good to have a lot of lactobacillus. So that's one of the takeaways that I wanted to give you from this. The first takeaway from this study is that the relationship of lactobacillus to Parkinson's is a little bit concerning, but we don't fully understand it. And the reason I say that is because there have been studies showing that people with Parkinson's who took lactobacillus probiotics had an improvement in constipation. And that's great. But for some reason, we're seeing this recurrent theme that lactobacillus is overabundant in Parkinson's. And so my advice right now would be to say, maybe don't take a probiotic that has lactobacillus in it until we understand more about the relationship. Now, another takeaway is that you really can't look at any one particular bacteria as good or bad. Like I mentioned with Prevotella, it's been shown in other studies that Prevotella has health benefits for certain people. Also, Prevotella is more abundant when you eat lots of fruits and vegetables, which is definitely a good thing for your health. It just shows that these fine points are not quite worked out yet. So suffice it to say that there's a lot that's just still unknown, but there are some really important themes coming out of the research. And one other thing I just wanted to mention is that studying the microbiome is actually helping us to explain why everyone might react differently to carbidopa-levodopa, which is the main treatment and medication we use to treat Parkinson's. For the 15 years that I've been treating Parkinson's, I have always wondered and tried to figure out why one of my patients can take carbidopa-levodopa like a champ and it fixes all their symptoms and they love it, they have no side effects. Well, and another person might not even be able to tolerate a half a tablet without developing severe nausea. Well, the microbiome seems to be showing us why this might be. So there's a bacteria called E. faecalis, which was shown in a study to actually eat levodopa. So the bacteria actually ingests the levodopa and converts it directly to dopamine in your gut. And that doesn't sound like such a bad thing because you want dopamine, but you don't actually want dopamine in your gut. You want the levodopa to make it to your brain where it can be converted safely to dopamine. If there's dopamine in your gut, you get nauseous and it doesn't really help your brain function much. So it seems like for some reason, when this E. faecalis is present, maybe the carbidopa-levodopa doesn't work quite as well. Now, that's not meant to scare you into worrying that you have E. faecalis in your microbiome. It might be okay, and who knows, it might actually have other beneficial effects. But it just helps us to understand why people react differently to drugs. And who knows, maybe even there's a way that the microbiome determines who gets dyskinesias from taking carbidopa-levodopa versus not. We just don't know that yet, but this is where the research is going. Now let's just get back to that question of whether or not you should take a probiotic. There are a myriad of probiotics on the market, and these are just a few of the ones that I know are scientifically sound. I don't endorse any one particular brand. But there's, and I also don't think that everyone needs to take a probiotic. But some particular, in some particular situations, they could be very beneficial. So remember that our microbiomes kind of need to be cultivated. You know, we have to take care of them. And so that's why taking a probiotic alone is not really going to make a big difference in your health unless you're doing some of the other practices that we talked about earlier on how to keep your gut and your bacteria healthy. But probiotics can definitely help in the right situation. And the main use that I see for them right now is to assist with the constipation of Parkinson's. Like we mentioned earlier, how critical having bowel movements is to ridding your system of this LPS, neuroinflammation. So probiotics can definitely help with that. Just be careful about which ones you take, and make sure you're taking all the other healthy lifestyle measures that we discussed earlier. Now, it's just a reminder too that the supplement industry is not regulated the way that the pharmaceutical industry is regulated. There was actually an alarming study in the journal Nature in 2015 that showed they looked at, I think, 14 or 15 of the most popular children's probiotics on the market. on the shelves of grocery stores. And they found that only one of those products actually contained what it said it did. So you have to be very careful. But these are all brands that are companies who tend to publish research on their products, publish randomized controlled trials even. And so I tend to trust these brands more than others. Now, in particular, I often recommend this probiotic from this company called Microbiome Labs. It's called Mega Spore Biotic. And the reason I like it is because it's, first of all, it's based on the concept that the good bacteria for us are the bacteria that are found in the dirt. You know, when our food is growing in healthy dirt, it's taking in these probiotics or these bacteria. And these are the bacteria that the Microbiome Labs Spore Biotic is based on. They are primarily bacillus species. And these are packaged, these naturally are covered by spores. So these bacteria are protected by a spore covering that allows it to be stable at room temperature. You take it in, it makes it through your stomach acid, and it gets to your colon where it should work. And there's actually been clinical trials that this company has done showing how taking the probiotic reduced LPS levels in the blood. They did a study using college kids as subjects, and they measured LPS levels in the college kids after they ate a big pizza meal versus not. And this probiotic did seem to reduce LPS levels. And I've had some good luck. I take it myself, and I've had some good luck also with patients of mine in treating Parkinson's related constipation with it. And it might also be good to just, if you're going to take a probiotic, to rotate through different types. And then you'll get to see which one actually works best for you. Okay. I think that's really all I had. And I want to just reiterate some take-home points to you. I hope this was a good overview of how the gut-brain axis functions and why gut and brain health are so tied together, especially in Parkinson's disease. So remember that research on the gut-brain microbiome axis is teaching us how the health of our intestinal lining and the bacteria that live there directly influences neurologic disorders like Parkinson's. Remember that this communication between the gut and brain is bidirectional. So our thoughts influence our gut and the state. Oh, here, sorry. Winnie wanted to say hi. And our gut actually influences the state of our brain. Now, in Parkinson's disease, the gut microbiome is disrupted. There is a finding of a certain dysbiosis, but we don't know exactly yet how to manipulate the microbiome in order to treat Parkinson's, but I think this is coming. Remember that lactobacillus seems to be overabundant in the microbiome of people with Parkinson's, and therefore it may be better to avoid taking lactobacillus probiotics if you have Parkinson's. And then finally, LPS. LPS seems to be a driver of neuroinflammation in Parkinson's, not to mention Alzheimer's disease and other myriad medical conditions. So keep LPS levels low by eating mostly a plant-based whole foods diet, and also taking measures that you need to take to help constipation. So that's really all I have. I know there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I look forward to addressing your questions. Here's just some resources for you. And I think, Jen, the slides will be available to people, right? So
yes. When you send them to me, I will post them. I will send them out to the participants, as well as they will be posted with your video on the YouTube channel.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Good.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you. I learned a lot, honestly. I had no idea we had 5 pounds of bacteria in our guts. So we are gonna, I know we're running long. I guess that's part of the beauty of Zoom. We don't have another speaker. We can stick around and participants can leave when they want to leave. I do have some questions, and I do want to give folks a moment to ask you questions. So if you have questions for Dr. Condefer, you can type them into the question and answer box, and I'm just going to kind of moderate the Q&A. Let's just stop sharing screens and they'll see everybody.
You want me to stop?
Oh yeah, stop doing that and they'll see us
Okay.
in full person, which could be scary, but that's okay. So take a moment, type in your questions. So I'm going to give a moment to do that. One of the things that you said, and this probably could be an entirely different talk, but you talked about how 80% of the immune system is located in your gut.
Right.
And in this whole COVID time and inflammation and things like that, does basically making your gut microbiome healthier, could that have implications to kind of making COVID, if you are exposed, not as impactful? What do you think about that?
I mean, it makes sense to me that it would, but I don't know that we have a lot of evidence to back that up. But absolutely, when you think about how the microbiome, how, first of all, 80% of your immune system located in your gut, mostly because of that huge surface area, in your gut that's exposed to the outside world. So it's, and the microbiome actually informs your immune system of how to work, how to operate properly. And so, it makes sense that having the healthiest, most diverse microbiome would assist your immune system in having the most proper, reaction to things like COVID. But as far as like particular ways to manipulate that is in regards to COVID, I haven't seen any studies, or I don't really know how to answer that.
Sure. It just helps boost your immune system to have a healthy gut.
Boost your immune system, and anything that helps boost your immune system is going to help us in these times that we're living.
Sure. So you, in the beginning, kind of described the gut as your second brain. So the question that was posed is, where in the gut is the second brain located?
Right. It's basically, so if you picture your gut as, the tubes and, it's your large intestine, small intestine, picture a network of nerves entwined and interlaced within your entire gut. That's your enteric nervous system. So it's not like there's a solid brain in your gut. It's more like a network of nerves and neurons and things called ganglia, which are groups of neurons that communicate together. Yeah. So it's more like a web of neurons that makes up your second brain that's in and around your gut.
Okay, great. Yeah. We got this is awesome. Will you address fecal replacement?
Fecal. So I know that there are, so first of all, what is fecal replacement? A fecal transplant is basically taking a pill that contains the poop of someone else. Okay. Now, this currently in medical practice, the main place where this is utilized is in people who suffer from C. difficile colitis. That's like a special type of infection in the colon that can happen when your gut microbiome is out of balance, or people get it after they've had repeated courses of antibiotics. So you take the fecal pill through the mouth, and then that's supposed to populate your colon. But again, remember how, doing a single intervention just helps for a short time because your microbiome turns over every 3 days. So the fecal transplant can sometimes boost, your levels of good bacteria, but it has to be maintained in certain ways. Now, in Parkinson's in particular, treating Parkinson's with fecal transplants, that's being studied. I don't know of any real results from those studies yet. Like it's hard to interpret because remember, we don't really have it all worked out, what are the problems with the microbiome in Parkinson's, but it's being looked at. And that's about all I could say about that right now. I mean, I can't really recommend that you go out yet and get a fecal transplant, but I think it's coming in the future. Yeah.
Okay, great. So what about Miralax for managing constipation?
Yeah, Miralax can be a lifesaver for a lot of people. Miralax, though, it kind of disrupts the normal absorption function of your gut. Now, it can be a big relief. I know people who really rely on Miralax in order to have bowel movements, and I think that's okay. I think having bowel movements with Miralax is better than not at all. But Miralax can be something that your colon can kind of get like accustomed to, and then it's like needs the Miralax in order to go. So it's probably best and Miralax just can disrupt the fluid and electrolyte balance in your digestive tract. So it's probably better. Sometimes I advise people to take it for 3 days in a row, then give your body a little break from it, for a few days, and then you can go back to it and rotate through other interventions for the constipation.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
We could probably do a whole talk on constipation.
I would
Yeah,
love to do that someday because it's such a complex topic. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is another one that kind of has to do with constipation. This person was kind of struggling with constipation, and now it's kind of flipped to loose stools. Would that have to do with the microbiome and with Parkinson's, or?
Now it could. Now, usually when your microbiome is in good balance, you shouldn't have loose stools. There's something else going on there. Loose stools can be caused by a lot of different things. They could be caused by a malfunction in some of the valves in the colon. It's a little more than, or it could just be the type of food you're eating, or it could be from overusing Miralax and substances like that can cause loose stools. So if that's happening, there's different things to look at. One thing is to look at the fiber in your diet and trying to increase the fiber to make the stools less loose. But I will say that just with Parkinson's disease in general, constipation is more what we see that's being caused by Parkinson's. Loose stools might be caused by some of the corrective mechanisms you're trying to use or other factors. And maybe it has something to do with the microbiome, but it's hard to say exactly what that would be. Yeah.
Okay, great. We actually had 2 questions about that, so both of them have been addressed. So wondering about a reliable test for microbiome types and levels. There seem to be a lot of companies that advertise this type of test, but are they valid? And then the second on that is, are you aware of any microbiome studies in Parkinson's that are currently recruiting?
Yeah, well, okay, so for part 1, that's a really good, I'm glad someone asked that about testing, because there are, like you said, there are many companies out there offering these test kits to test your microbiome, and there's even, and they're pretty reliable, but the question is, what are we going to do with the information? We don't yet know exactly. Like, you might get a report back and it's going to be really hard to interpret is the point. We talked about that you can have 3 different enterotypes, that really every person, we all fit into one of those types. Well, you might be able to find out which enterotype you have through one of those tests. But the problem is, well, okay, what are we going to do about it then? We don't necessarily know what to do with the information or how to manipulate it. And that's how to manipulate those, bugs in your system, or which bugs do you want more of and which do you want less of. So I haven't been advocating so much for people to go out and get their microbiome tested yet, but rather to maybe follow a lot of the lifestyle things we presented here and healthy eating habits that promote a good microbiome, rather than worrying so much about getting a test and which bacteria do I have, which don't I have. At least not yet. In the future, those tests might become more important as we get more targeted therapies based on the microbiome. Does that make sense? That it's just kind of like, yet I think it's still a little too early, and that we don't really know what to do with the information.
Right. That getting you tested, you're not going to go anywhere with it. Just do the
What
stuff that's going to make it better.
Other than just trying to do the things that we talked about today to have the healthiest microbiome possible. Now, wait, what was the second part of that question again?
Are you aware of any studies about that are testing with particularly the gut biome and Parkinson's?
Right. I wish I knew particular place to refer you to, but I do not. I do know that the study that I cited where they, the big study where we took those 3 points about the Parkinson's microbiome, part of that study was done with a cohort from Seattle. So I know that there's people at University of Washington looking into this. I just don't know the group names, or I don't know how to get people enrolled in the studies, but I'm sure that resources like maybe APDA website, Michael J. Fox Foundation, they usually have really good comprehensive lists of all the different studies out there that you might be eligible for. So I would say check out those websites for studies.
And clinicaltrials.gov.
Exactly.
That's like the whole thing of everything. So that's a great resource. And I'll inquire with the UW folks to see if they are aware of that. I also haven't heard of another study, just off the top of my head. So,
and Jen, I'm going to put
a couple more questions.
Sorry, Jen. In the chat, I'm going to put about the Washington State Parkinson's Disease Registry. Encouraging people to sign up for that if they want to know about studies, if they're from Washington, in this area.
Okay, great. Couple more questions for you. So these two are sort of related. Someone's saying they've always eaten Cheerios for breakfast. So, and I think Wilma tomorrow is kind of about practical tips on creating your healthy gut microbiome, which, Kelly alluded to on some of those, and Wilma will go into a little bit more, but what should we eat for breakfast? And then there was a question about yogurt.
Okay, good questions. Okay, what should we, this is hard. I know when I heard about Cheerios, I was a little bit heartbroken too, because and Cheerios are, everyone in the world eats Cheerios, but it truly is the place I'm getting my information from. So it's called, the website is www.detoxproject.org. And that project is, they've done really widespread testing on, foods, commercial foods of all sorts, and tested them for glyphosate residue. And that's where that Cheerios, unfortunately, it came out at the top. And it's because they spray oats with glyphosate now, unfortunately. So what do you eat? Okay, if you can't have your Cheerios, what do you eat? Well, there's a lot of different options, and it depends on what is right for your constitution and what type of diet you're following. I think trying to eat more organic type cereals probably have lower residues of glyphosate. Now, the other thing you can think of doing is eating a good whole grain, like bread, like I'm talking really whole grain, I like Dave's Killer Bread and those types of things that have lots of seeds in them and things, if your body can handle that, because that's a lot of good fiber. And then having something on that like avocado, or even a good egg, preferably an egg that was like organic, if you have access to it, or if you have your own chickens, even better. so, and or a bowl of oatmeal that has, is trying to get more organic oats. You can go on that detox project and find what foods had kind of the lower residue types, like lower amounts of glyphosate residue, to stick with those. Eating fruit for breakfast is excellent. I mean, that's probably one of the best choices. Yeah.
And that might be a great question for Wilma tomorrow as well.
Yeah, Wilma is going to have so much of that information for you tomorrow. Like, I'm sure she'll give a much better answer than me.
Sure.
Now, what about yogurt?
Yogurt, yeah.
So yogurt, generally in Parkinson's, we do see that people who consume high amounts of dairy products seem to get more Parkinson's, and they seem to not do quite as well with Parkinson's. And we don't quite know why that is. Some of that is connected to the gut microbiome though. Now yogurt is a little different because yogurt is cultured. Yogurt has good bacteria in it, but a lot of yogurt does have lactobacillus. So remember, we said there's kind of an overabundance of lactobacillus. But that doesn't mean that eating some yogurt for breakfast is bad for you. I mean, I think it's all in the amounts. And if you're going to eat yogurt, it's probably best to eat the full fat, no sugar, plain Greek, especially the Greek yogurt is beneficial. Trying to get organic if you can. Those are all good. So yeah, having a little bit of yogurt for breakfast is not terrible. I think of all dairy products, yogurt is probably the best one to consume. Okay. But again, I'll be curious to see what Wilma says about that too.
Yeah. How about gluten? There's a lot of gluten-free, to avoid gluten. What about gluten and Parkinson's?
Gluten and Parkinson's, there's not a known connection there. But there is a connection. Gluten does have effects on the brain, or it can, in susceptible individuals. So what happens is some people, like the most extreme example of it is people who have celiac disease, and they have an actual allergy to gluten, which inflames their intestines, disrupts that gut barrier function. It disrupts their immune function in their gut. It prevents them from assimilating nutrients. And then the gluten, as a neurologist, I actually treat neurologic effects of celiac disease pretty frequently. So gluten can have effects on the brain. There's some evidence that even in people who aren't allergic to gluten, that maybe gluten, too much of it, isn't good for our brains. There's a number of studies, and there's a number of books that have been written about that, like Grain Brain by Dr. Perlmutter is one example. There's not really a strong connection with Parkinson's though, and gluten, as far as I'm aware, I guess is the bottom line.
Yes. Okay. Where am I going to go with this? Oh my gosh, there's more. If oats are bad for Cheerios, do all wheat products have the same issues? Well, or is it really just oats?
It's hard. It's hard. You could go on Detox Project and just look at how their food testing, what they found. The thing is that, glyphosate is sprayed on a lot of commercial crops in this country, not in huge amounts. It's interesting because the glyphosate, the amounts that farmers use is very low, compared to the amount, if you took it and sprayed it all over your yard, you're getting exposed to much higher amounts. So at any rate, but yeah, so there's glyphosate on wheat products too, but we can't live in a bubble. We have to, and our bodies do have a way to process some of this stuff as long as you're limiting your exposure to it. So yeah, don't worry about, every single thing you eat and whether there's glyphosate in it. There might be, I mean, I actually, if you're really concerned about it, you can actually on the detoxproject.org, there's a way to actually get yourself tested for glyphosate. And I did it myself. I sent them, you have to pull out a bunch of your hair and you mail your hair to them and they test you for glyphosate residue. And for me, I was surprised. They didn't detect any, which was great. And I'm pretty careful about what I eat, but I eat breads, I sometimes eat things I shouldn't eat, and I was okay. So if you're really worried about it, you can go and get a test done. You can send in a hair sample, but you can stick to more, organic things when you can, homemade things, are organic grains, non-GMO, non-genetically modified foods are the best.
Mhm.
Okay, when it comes to wheat and oats and things like that.
Yeah. Okay, great. I got another wonderful presentation. How common do you think these ideas are being used in the treatment of PD, and are docs getting this information, or is it not quite out there in the PD lexicon? Yeah.
I think it's getting there. It's not quite out there in the PD lexicon. I think some neurologists, some of my partners might look at some of this thing and things that I've talked about and look at me sideways and wonder what I'm talking about. Because unless they have sought out the information themselves, they might not be using it in their own practice yet. But I think it's coming. It's coming there, and more and more doctors are just becoming aware of the importance of the microbiome in general. I don't see a lot of my partners, talking to people about these concepts. I think doctors who are naturopaths and who are functional medicine doctors are much more informed in this stuff than your average MD, like me, like medical doctor.
Mhm.
So it's you have to kind of work, and some of this, luckily we live in a world where all this information is available. So through programs like this, we can just help lead you in a direction, even if your doctor doesn't fully know about all these things. You can ask them about it, and it might spur them to read a little more.
Okay. All right. There's a couple more questions, but they're very individualized. So I might send those to you and have you answer them, and then I can send them back. Because we have gone way over, but which is fine, because that's the beauty of this. We don't have another speaker. People can leave as they want. It's totally great. So thank you so very much. This was very interesting. I learned a lot, and there's a lot of things I want to read up on. So tomorrow is the continuation of this two-part series. Hopefully you can see my screen. Tomorrow will be the healing power of food. So Wilma Shaw is a nutritional therapy practitioner, and she's board certified in holistic nutrition, and she is going to be talking about practical tips in implementing this. So she will be tomorrow. And same time, same link that you used. It'll be the same thing, 10:30 a.m. tomorrow, and Wilma will do that. And I will share with you Dr. Condefer's slides, and we will post this on our YouTube channel. And you can always email us at apdanw@apdaparkinson.org to ask any questions or engage with us. And I guess that's it for today. So I really hope that you have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. We hope we will see you tomorrow, or at least see your names tomorrow up on the attendee list. And thank you very much, Dr. Condefer. Appreciate your time so much and your insights.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen.
All right.
Next time.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.